the past. And it seems sometimes that that's kind of a male thing. There are lots of good reasons to get married, and one of them is that a wife helps you to remember all those things that you have long since forgotten. So, if it happens that I remember something, then it must be pretty important. It must have had some impact on my life. I really am this kind of person, so it's somewhat intentional that you can't do anything about the past. You learn from it. Hopefully you do less stupid things in the future, and you live in the present with your eyes on the future. That's kind of how I live. But there is a memory that's 35 years old. It was the summer of 1983. Debbie, my wife, and I had been married 2 years. And when I was a wee lad, actually my brother-in-law started teaching me golf when I was like 8 years old. My sister and him got me this little 5-iron, and bless his heart, he and I would go out golfing together, and he'd let me just swing away. And so that too is a cool memory. But in those days, if you happen to be able to have some life experience under your belt, you'll know that Arnold Palmer was one of the big golf legends of the time, and those who would follow him around the golf course. And there was something very significant about that people yearned to do that. They were called Arnie's Army. And so I always wanted to be a part of Arnie's Army. I go, that would just be the most precious of things. Well, in 1983, the U.S. Senior Open comes to Hazeltine National Golf Course in the Twin Cities. We were in the Twin Cities at that time. I was going to seminary. Debbie was going to graduate school. She was also working full-time. When she left that position, they literally hired 3 people to replace her. So again, if you choose to get married, gentlemen, marry wisely. So somehow in that, I considered it some level of miracle, because we had very little money coming in, and we had issues of food, clothing, and shelter, plus the educational expenses, that we never had a difficulty paying a bill. But nor did we ever have an extra dime in those days. So again, having a good wife, she said, Arnold Palmer is now in the latter stages of his career. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for you. We're going to go, despite however it is that we'll come across the money. So we do, and we're walking up to the main entrance, and a guy approaches us, and he says, I have 2 extra tickets. Would you like them? He didn't say, I have 2 tickets. Would you like to buy them? He gave them to us and walked away. Now, he doesn't have really any kind of inkling the impact of that still speaks to me 35 years later. And there's a tad sadness in that I really don't remember walking alongside of Arnie's Army, even though I remember that I clearly did that for 18 holes. And I remember thinking, I've never seen anyone hit golf balls the way these professionals do. It's a different game for them, but okay. And I remember afterwards the feeling that lives with me of that satisfaction. In those days we didn't call it bucket list, but clearly this was a bucket list thing for me. That again still is something that, having known that I did this, is meaningful to me. But still, it is powerful to recognize that what I remember is the man who came up to us when we didn't have money and said, here are a couple tickets, would you like them? During October, it is the normal time where we in our congregation encourage one another to think about how we're going to serve God in the next 12 months from the perspective of our personal lives. And so you should have gotten a yellow piece of paper, and that's what that form is. I encourage you to fill it out and to make it as an offering sometime by the end of October. Now, it's kind of sad when so oftentimes we immediately think of money, and people get often critical of such, and they go, oh, well, that's just because the church is looking for money. And yeah, the church needs money. That it costs money to make a church go. But this has absolutely nothing to do with that. This is all about the personal opportunity for the joy of generosity. And that's what I believe is so sad, really, when people miss out on that. That is really what God holds before you. And in a sense, it is a test. God's saying, are you going to trust me? And I so desire that people would have that opportunity to say, yeah, I'm going to trust that when I seek to bless others, that God is going to make sure that everything I need will be provided. It's a curiosity in the Bible. Even Jesus will say when confronted by Satan and the temptations, you don't test God, okay? Jesus, go jump off a cliff, and the angels, it even says in the Bible, so says the devil, yes it does, we'll lift you up, that's where, an eagle's wings comes from. So Satan is quoting that. And Jesus says, but you don't tempt or test God. Oh, okay. Except for once. When it comes to generosity, then God actually says, I want you to test me. It's kind of like, yikes. This isn't a trick question now, is it? Yeah. And see, says God, if I don't bless you even more, then however it is you are generous. And for me, that is always the great delight in this, that you can't outgive God. That every time you take a step of generosity, maybe when a part of you goes, well, I don't know, you always see a blessing that comes back, at least as significant. Well, I recently had the opportunity to be on the other side of the Arnie's Army miracle. As you may know, if you know me at all, I hang out in the world. I figure the absolute worst place a pastor can reside is in one's church office, because unchurched people are never going to come there. So I go out and seek to find people wherever they are out there, and I hang out oftentimes in a coffee shop and what have you. Well, there's one person that I have come to know somewhat recently, a young woman, and I've been on vacation, so that's why we weren't here last Sunday, and we had spent more time in Branson than we normally do. And so I was talking with this person about that, and she had some awareness of the places that I was referencing, and especially, do you know this Johnny Morris guy, the head of Bass Pro? I mean, his story is extraordinary. He starts out selling a few fishing lures in his dad's liquor store, and now he's a multi-billionaire. That's a lot of fishing lures. Evidently, a lot of you people go fishing. I don't know. And so, including in our last trip, he is like reconfiguring Southwest Missouri single-handedly. And you don't have to go to hardly anything of what he does to immediately notice everything he does is over the top. It's just extraordinary. And so we were talking about that, and this woman's husband, it's his birthday, and so he really wanted to go to one of those locations. And so, I talked about having experienced it and having a connection that, the people who like me say I'm frugal. The people that aren't so sure call me cheap. Whatever, I am not a person that readily digs out my wallet and says, here, just take my money. But I said, while it's kind of expensive, if there ever was anything worth it, this really is. And she goes, oh, thanks. It's really good to know that. To have that kind of affirmation, because I'd said to my husband that, this is your birthday, and I love you, and we'll do this even if it means dipping into our savings. It was that moment that God sort of slapped me side the face, as he does, It's genteel, but there nonetheless. And I remembered 35 years ago when someone came up to me and said, I've got 2 tickets. Would you like them? My sense was this wasn't a live or die moment. God was not going to get upset with me, but he just sort of laid this opportunity out there. And he goes, Scott, you remember 35 years ago, right? Sure do. This is your opportunity to be on the other side of that miracle. So I tell her the story of Arnie's Army, and I give her the money that's required. From my perspective, it's negligible. I don't miss that amount of money at this stage in my life. But for her, it was a big deal. So at one level, it was cool to bless her, but at the same time, to have that kind of joy that immediately overcomes you. To, from my vantage point, so simply being able to bless her life in a way that was significant. There again is what God sets before us and how he so beckons us to take the risk of trusting God, and that you find that cheerful giver opportunity, that joy of generosity that really is a feeling that happens in no other way of life. And it's so hard for people really to get to that point. It felt like I saw that struggle in one of the experiences of Branson. We've been going to Branson for 22 years. Most years we have season passes to Silver Dollar City. We've also gone to Showboat, Branson Bell, and Sight and Sound Theater. That's kind of what we normally do. We rarely go to shows. But this time we said we were going to spend more time there, and we would actually take in a few of the shows. I must add, just to keep my frugal identity going, that we never paid more than half for any of the shows. Just saying. They can be kind of spendy, but that's me again. One of the shows, we actually were fully aware of the baritone. 22 years ago, he kind of got his start in Branson through Silver Dollar City, as many of the people do in Branson. And we had grown some affection for him. And so we thought, okay, because he's part of this group now, we'll go check it out. As it happened, we ended up in the first row. And we were aware that when you sit in the first row, you're going to experience things perhaps a little differently than anyone else in the theater. Okay. So it begins, and the lead singer, from my perspective, is like leering at all the women in the first row. And curiously as it was, at least in the center portion, I was the only guy. There were women on both sides of us. And my wife, those of you who know my wife, she is like the most genteel person. She will be very slow to be critical or something like that. She identified the lead singer as the Lech. Okay, so you don't have to believe me. You can believe her. She's more believable. Well, then the funny guy comes out. You know, most Branson shows have a funny guy. And he points at me, and he goes, "You're sure sitting funny. Got pimples on your butt?" I go, "Really? That's funny. Really? Why was I sitting funny?" I was. Because I was leaning into my wife, physically telling Mr. Lech, "You will not look at my wife the way you're looking at the rest of the women in this front row." Well, Mr. L comes down and he sings a song to the front row like they often will do. He sings a song about wanting to have sex with a person, and he picks out the youngest woman in the front row. He's 50 or so. She probably was in her 20s, but she could have been a teenager. I was sick. I was already getting pretty incensed. And then he goes, after the song is done, and proceeds to hug each woman down the line, including my wife. That made my feelings even less happy. And then he had been connecting with a woman on the front row. And so he goes, jumps on her lap, and hops up and down. For me, it was a sexual thing. I don't know what it could be. Most indelicately put, it seemed like when a dog humps your leg. And the people roared in laughter. I go, really? Branson's supposedly all about family, being very Christian in its orientation. I had and continue to have some difficulties. And I will be following up. You're just very fortunate that it's been a week and a half since this has gone on, because only now am I able to speak to it in a way that's borderline appropriate. That's the deal with God and his people. God is steadfast in his love, and he's gracious and forgiving and whatever. But there is a covenant here in that God who says, I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting iniquity to the third and fourth generation, but blessing those who love me to the 1,000th generation. That's what Joshua is referencing here, what I call the preamble to the Ten Commandments. And then he proceeds to remind the people about really the first commandment, what I think sets the stage for all the rest of the commandments. I, the Lord your God, I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods. Because we've been tracing now God and his people. That's what we do in the fall. And so we started out with the creation of humanity, and time again, people choose poorly. They have the very best of God's provision. They are created in God's image, but somehow they figure that there's some little piece that is separating us from God, and that's unacceptable. We are not willing to live there. So I'm going to do whatever I can to try to figure out what that is. I'm going to do whatever I can, really, ultimately, although I'm not going to say it that way, to become God myself. And that's what people keep on doing. It's just one story after another of which this is true. And I call it the human experiment. God, desperately being love himself, wants to experience and express love. That's why he creates humans. And he has these various phases when he tries something and they fail time and again. So finally, you're going to have the final solution, that is Jesus, when God takes it upon himself. Because we clearly can't do it. So when we get to this part, the book of Joshua is obviously about Joshua. Moses had gotten the people out of the 400 years of slavery. And note that as you're thinking through, okay, God always does get things right. You can be confident about that. But it was 400 years that the people were enslaved in Egypt. That's a really long time. It's easy for us to say, well, it's 400 years. If you put that in the context of like the history of America or whatever it is, somehow to get this into chronology, that's a lot of history. So while God's going to make it happen, God is always looking for that one person who has his heart that will be fully focused on doing what God would have him to do. So it took 400 years, but you end up with Moses. So you have 10 plagues that God does, nasty things, to try to convince Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, to let the people go. Finally, number 10 is so devastating, his firstborn son is killed, and Pharaoh, in despair, says, get out of here. But then that grief moves into anger, and he decides he's going to chase down the people. And so now they've already experienced 10 miracles, as if that shouldn't be enough. And so they end up, they're at the sea. They go, oh, Moses, you should have just left us in Egypt. I knew you were an idiot. At least we had food there. We're just going to die. We're going to be slaughtered here. What's the matter with you, Moses? Well, God opens the way for them to get across. They get across. The Egyptian soldiers are swallowed up. Okay, so now they're in the desert. And God says, all right, you've seen now personally 11 huge miracles. So now I want you to go into the promised land. It's been 700 years, basically, since I gave this promise to Abraham. And so go in there and take the land. And so they send in a couple of spies. They come back and go, well, they're big people, but we can do this. And the people go, well, tell us more about those big people. Well, yeah, they're kind of big people. They're really nasty looking. They're kind of fierce. And they go, well, maybe we'll just hang out in the wilderness. So they don't trust God, even after those immediate 11 huge miracles. God's not happy. He says, fine. A whole generation of you will die in the wilderness, in this desert, including Moses himself. Well, the 40 years go by. Joshua, thankfully, is a person that has God's heart to come alongside of Moses and take the next step. And so we often don't have it in our heads like that. Everybody goes, whoa, Moses parting the Red Sea and all that kind of stuff. Yeah, but evidently there's some strategic piece of this too. We're going to trust God, but we're not going to be stupid. And so they don't go straight north into where all the nasty kind of people lived. But they go around, and they come over the Jordan River then. So they have to cross there. There's a second crossing of water, and that now happens with Joshua. And in this, God is reminding them of, well, okay, the miracles didn't stop at those 11. They just keep coming. You were hungry? I sent food for you from the sky, for heaven's sake. You were thirsty? Told Moses, hit a rock and water comes out. Time after time a miracle. And all of these different kinds of peoples, all of them that wanted to get in your way and stop you from coming and being a part of this land, I defeated them for you. I did it. Not you and your military might. I did it. You might know the song, Joshua the Battle of Jericho, right? Well, Jericho was a very fortressed city. And so they come and they march around it and they scream and the walls come down. Well, that's a pretty big miracle too. So time and again, you have these miracles. Well, now Joshua's getting old. It's his swan song. So he's got to really kind of put it all together here. And he says, I'm concerned for you people. It always has been an issue for us that we often are tempted and do allow other gods to creep into the picture. Even, he references Abraham, those people of that time. It was true. Abraham was worshiping all sorts of other gods when God shows up and says, hey, I'm really the only one. And Abraham goes, okay, well, all right. And that's the thing that still is with Joshua now. He says, what are you going to do when I die, okay? You're not going to have me around anymore. Are you going to be stupid when I leave? Because some of you might want to go, you still remember the Egyptian gods. You could do that when you were in slavery for such a long period of time. Huge part of your history. You could align yourself with any of the gods that you discovered here in the Promised Land, because there were all sorts of people living here. They were worshiping all sorts of different kinds of gods. Some of you might have intermarried a little bit. Now you're bringing those into your household. I remind you, says Joshua, God is jealous, and God says he's your only God. So you're going to have to choose. And that's the thing I think that's certainly true in our time and is always true of humans. We want our cake and eat it too. We really think that somehow I go, yeah, I believe in God, and that's just like, that takes care of it. And I can do absolutely whatever I want. I can let all sorts of little g gods into my life, and it's all good. And at least what we hear from the Bible, God doesn't agree. Bad things happen. There are consequences when we have that kind of perspective. And so Joshua really ends it up by saying, you're going to each have to choose. But for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that's the kind of place that I see us, and not the least of which being in. Even particularly for those of us who say we follow Jesus, because that's where Satan's going to come and mess with us the most. You know, and having that heart of God means that I'm saying that the driving force of my life, the only driving force of my life that I want is God. No more, no less. And that wells up within me then, that cheerful giver, that joy of generosity that overwhelms you, that comes with the package. And a part of the issue is that oftentimes we will think, well, then, you know, my life's just really going to be good. And so if my life isn't really good, if there are challenges, then evidently God's not with me or I'm doing something wrong. No. If you have the heart of God, God is always confronting the darkness, so his heart is there. And I mean, if you have his heart, that means you're going to be in the darkness. You are going to be in the midst of things. But you bring with you the light of God, and the light of God is always victorious. That's the deal. And there too, what is really ultimately cooler than that? To be there when God works miracles. So again, the series is God works miracles through you. Once in a while, God just shows up and zaps. That happens. But the vast majority of miracles are done by God when he finds a willing partner who says, I want to have the heart of God. And God says, cool, I'm going to work miracles through you. And not only does that bless those around you, but of all things, those blessings come heaping back at you as well. So the question for you today is, where are the threats for you to compromise, to let in little g gods in life? Pray that God would make those abundantly clear to you. Pray that God would help you take a next step of focusing ever more clearly on him and him alone. Because if you're looking for miracles, and who doesn't love a good miracle? The way for that path is by having the heart of God. In the week ahead, you will have opportunities. You will have challenges. How will you bring the heart of God to those? How will you bring the light of Christ to those? How will you say in coming alongside of Joshua, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord?